A friend of long standing who I met in the Seattle poetry scene asked me if I would be so good as to cover in book reviews with more depth some of the books that I've been reading and attempting to bring the person's attention. He said maybe people would be more interested in your video about books if you went into the story of books that have impressed you a little more deeply. I can't imagine that somebody would spend more time with a video of mine than they would with a newspaper or a book of their own choosing. But I did decide to honor my friend's wish, thinking he at least might watch. I often wonder as a library clerk why people don't read more, but in wondering, I expect an answer, and I've come to certain conclusions about what might explain that. For one thing, there are a lot of books, and we live in a current affairs world. People want to keep abreast and assert themselves, and they want to think that they're on top of their game, and a book takes away from the spontaneity of thinking. It asks you to indulge. And of course, a book may come from decades ago, which means it's informed by the cultural bias of those decades, or perhaps maybe even may be dead wrong. Or if you're familiar with my own detective work and categorical thinking, it might even be deliberately misleading. Extreme examples of that come up in my writing, like the Warren Report, which is a falsehood. All the King's Men, which is a fiction by Robert Penn Warren, which is supposedly about Huey Long. It's fiction. So, at what point does fiction begin, fiction end? What point you need to read 10 books in order to get an inside and informed view of one. So there's a lot of inhibiting factors, reasons to be afraid of a book, because you don't have the perspective that's needed to vie with it. Well, all of those are, of course, explanations, but they're not necessarily good reasons for not reading. One of the more hotly contested philosophical writers is Ayn Rand, who believed that man should be self-interested and driven by reason. I've often had to defend my admiration for the Fountainhead. The Fountainhead isn't as long as Atlas Shrugged, which I don't admire nearly as much. I've often wondered why people aren't more impressed with this from the left. I realize that it sells a right-wing doctrine about persons having the right to profit from their work. It doesn't seem so bad. What's interesting is that she gets off with this in a scene of that many leftists would recognize of the young man dropping out of school because the curriculum isn't relevant to him. You know, in black psychology and courses about African American history, I've heard from experts that white literacy is a standardized view of refusal to study black. And when you look at standards, as miseducation, misinforming. Some people decide they want to get away from it, so they drop out of school, which is what this guy did. And it goes through a society that's familiar to us, 1950s America. Groups of employed people getting together in free time with cocktail parties. Families who fight for attention, and rivals who cut each other down. And the way that they cut each other down takes on a certain representation at the hands of this skillful philosopher, which is that they're cutting these people down because they can achieve something, because they're part of their aristocracy of talent. It might sound strange to compare that to a group like Black Lives Matter, but Black lives do matter. And there are people who angle to cut them down just because they do. Because black people are in the aristocracy of talent. They take on something that's relevant. You know, that they're black, that they're from African American society. And I think that it's disingenuous for somebody to just come out against something because the person is black or because the person believes in freedom of speech. It's just looking for some, you know, bias convenience to attack somebody. And there's remarkable sub-stories. I think of two of them, which would in no way spoil the book by sharing. One of them is when this architect, Howard, goes to see a sculptor he admires. And the sculptor is drunk, refuses to let him in, and is obviously in some kind of state of breakdown. And he says, "What's wrong with you, boy?" And the dude is like, you know, "Oh, you're that dude who's getting all the press, you know." And he says, "I don't know anything about the press." He said, "What do you want to bother me for?" And he says, "I love your work. I want you to do something with me." And the guy's like, "Tell me about it. You love my work." People have manipulated him by appeal to his ego over and over again to the point where he's so crushed by their fake reasons that he no longer wants to even try to believe that he might have a peer. And Howard says, "Look, calm down. I'm going to take care of you for a few days." And they set off to build a temple of the human spirit together. And the antagonists who funded the temple of the human spirit did it so they could tear it down and say it was worthless to begin with. And of course, this brings back the initial crisis for Steve. And Howard tells him what matters is that it existed. So there's some very beautiful things. And they say that Ayn Rand lacked humanity towards the weak, but there's a beautiful denouement where a young girl with Down syndrome finds an undestroyed place in this building and makes it her niche. And I'm telling you that a person who can comprehend something like that has a lot to offer in terms of insight. The Fountainhead is a spectacular book. Ayn Rand might not be a spectacular person, and Atlas Shrugged may not be a spectacular book, but The Fountainhead certainly is. This is a comic book published by Classics Illustrated about Abraham Lincoln that shows him wrestling for, you know, a Senate race against a rival. And it has images of him detesting slavery, something that is contested by some of the historians. And it has him asking Mary Todd to dance with him in the very worst way, which she does, it says. And it gives facts and story to a remarkable president. And you wonder, wouldn't it be more important to read a book? Well, not necessarily if you're a very young person learning about the country of the United States and the issues that we face. Some of the books that have been written about Abraham Lincoln are probably more biased than that classic illustrated is. But it also comes down to how much you really want to know a great deal about him. How much does one really want to know about Copernicus, Kepler, Tycho Brahe? Arthur Koestler made it a point to write a book about these astronomers called The Sleepwalkers. And it's not, for me, really a page turner, but it explains the society of evolving understanding of the universe through a period of history that includes, parts of the Dark Ages. The 11th century, 12th century. He does it with poetry. He does it with biographical snippets about their lives and how they interacted, what schools they went to, who their influences were. And it's quite a thick and heavy book. And he indulged this issue of the search for man to awaken into an understanding of the universe through the invention of the telescope and so on. And it's deeply indulgent of the literary arts concerning the times of Kepler, Galileo, the discovery of the laws of gravity, and there are poems. It answers such questions as, what is the meaning of weight? What does it mean when something is said to be heavy? He quotes from Samuel Butler on Kepler, The Elephant in the Moon. Quote, the inhabitants of the moon, who when the sun shines hot at noon, do live in cellars underground of 8 miles deep and 80 around, in which at once they fortify against the sun the enemy, because their people's civiler than those rude peasants that are found to live upon the upper ground, called Privolans, with whom they are perpetually at open war. And so it works its way through Paris and Madrid and Italy, and in a sing-song manner contributes to a creation of something of a Sistine Chapel for the study of ancient astronomers, as told by Arthur Koestler. There are other reasons a person might look at books. I don't want to offend you with this, but this is the original book, 10 Little Indians. And tells the story of systematic killing of people who are being held hostage to a killer in search of a whodunit. And there's something about mystery that begins to go in the direction of horror, which becomes very real in my vocation when you have a crossover from somewhere like George Romero's studios in Pittsburgh committing infamous acts of torture and murder. And you ask yourself, is the world actually improving? as we tamper with something like a title? Or is it rendering invisible and harder to see the criminals among us? These are hard questions. I don't propose to say that I know all of the answers to them. This remarkable book is out of print, Geopolitics of the Visible, Essays on Philippine Film Cultures. One of the things you might notice is the caption of something from a gangster movie. But it starts in the very beginning of filmmaking. You may not know this, or you may have heard of it. But Mark Twain was one of the original dissenters against America's imperial wars. Back in the days of Grover Cleveland, when America was starting to toy with the idea of being a world power and contesting Europe and South America and so on. We started a war in the Philippines that left Mark Twain absolutely indignant. And his protest against it could be read as a metaphor for the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, the war in Central America, the war in the Middle East. He really got into it. He was a brilliant writer. Well, this tells the story, for example, of the invention of war as authentic documentary species through false portrayals. During the war in Vietnam, a reporter actually helped position a prisoner for execution so it looked more interesting to the viewers back home, and a horrifying piece. And the pictures of him helping position, the execution were not published at first. You can see them now, but they're still nowhere near as widespread as the horrifying execution. So manipulation by film of the way that people perceive things in colonial wars started to come out, at the turn of the 20th century, back at the end of the 19th century. And it goes into the story of Filipino heroines and movie stars and the attempt to build a Filipino cinema. Their domestic situation has common threads that ours does not. You would have to understand what it means to be a single woman who has to go off and work in Hong Kong and abandon her daughter and lose touch with her daughter during her upbringing, her daughter turning to drugs, prostitution, and her coming home and all of the recriminations as something of a normal for some of the lower middle class who have to make their living selling themselves as domestics in a foreign country, which gets particularly evil when you get into the direction of prostitution. Our society went through the 60s with all this love stuff. But the International Feminism Networking Against Female Sexual Slavery, a conference in Rotterdam, points out that love is the way that women get lured into trafficking overseas. That once they're vulnerable in another country, they can be taken hostage and used. It's horrifying that our media doesn't do more to educate and thus protect. We wall ourselves off and as if nothing is real. Hollywood and Hitler is a remarkable book about the actual movie studios and how they had to negotiate with German market planning before the outbreak of war by letting go of Jewish employees and things like this. What sort of documentaries made it past the censors in America because they were afraid of offending the censors in Germany. It doesn't have Ronald Reagan in the index, which is, to me, an intolerable oversight. But it does tell a great deal about how cinema was seen in the Axis by Mussolini and his family, and how MGM adapted to the crisis. You know, when we get into our own, you know, backyard, nothing is more interesting than the book A Heritage of Stone by Jim Garrison. A shocked and saddened New Orleans DA, who was the topic of a movie by Oliver Stone, finds himself at the center of an investigation that's absolutely thankless because Oswald had been in New Orleans. And he turns up lead after lead after lead that the Warren Commission refused to acknowledge. And he starts to see a picture that forces him to consider the possibility of a secret state being built in the United States and Kennedy assassinated by an inside job. One of the things that's troubling to many people who've come to become a bit uncomfortable with America as it now isn't just the laws about things like that and government and the false wars, but something reinterpreting modern culture has helped me with. It's a study about Nietzsche by a man who believes that Nietzsche actually had a philosophy. He wasn't just a running thread of things that were interesting to grasp because they were anti-authoritarian, hated sacred cows, Twilight of the Idols, and so forth, drumming up, his will to power. And this professor reanalyzes it for its content. And Ayn Rand said about Nietzsche, he sometimes was really spot on, but a lot of the time he was so contradictory you couldn't follow him rationally. This teacher believes that's the point he's making, that people can get excited about things that are contradictory, that the will to power means embracing paradox, that it isn't just hypocrisy at work when you contradict. It's excitement, it's stimulation. And, when you talk about the world being paradox, yin and yang and so forth, the issue of Buddhists, you get into a very interesting field of study. At my former school, where I met some very important professionals in the study of African American psychology and history, I also found that there was an aversion to adopting the linguistic complications that would come with the inclusion of Asian studies. When you start talking about bodhisattvas and, Dalai Lamas and the concerns of Chinese Americans and the Chinese exclusion laws, it starts to go to the dogs because people start arguing whose genocide is more important. The black genocide, the Jewish genocide, the Indian Native American genocide. Do they cancel each other out? Should we just strike the set and start again with symbols of survival like Noah's Ark? Well, I think what we need is appreciation. I think that's the magic word. And this is a very appreciative book about the way that Tibetan Buddhists shared in the community efforts to make modern China. Before Mao, for whatever reason, ran amok again, they were getting along. And it tells the story of these Buddhists in the Himalayas and Chinese diplomats who went there and loved them, and the efforts to build community. The efforts to build community in Asia are ongoing and reasonable ones, and they come from the magic word appreciation. We need to be able to keep an understanding going of how important it is to appreciate other cultures by learning about them. One of the things we talk about scornfully sometimes is victim status. There's such a thing as a victim. This remarkable book, Refugees in Hungary in World War II, tells of the humane struggle by democracies to deal with the tidal wave of people trying to escape Adolf Hitler. Even when people are not refugees, sometimes they live in poverty. This remarkable book is an attempt to assess what people need when they're impoverished. I think back to the refugees in Europe, Eastern Europe, in World War II. The topic of the book, Refugees in Hungary, comes up in James Michener's Poland. And one of the first cruel things that the occupying Germans did was break, the bowls, the ceramic bowls that the Polish poor used to make bread. And understanding poverty helps understand what very specific things go on in impoverished cultures in terms of education and desired education, child labor and the desire to help children escape child labor, single family homes, single parent homes, and to what degree loans are well applied or not well applied. It's by a variety of writers who take on a number of different issues. To give you an example of their range: poverty persistence and design of anti-poverty policies, safety nets in poor countries, racial stigma, fertility in developing countries, and each one is by a person who has studied and specialized in that. One of the books I picked up on recently, Let the Record Speak by Dorothy Thompson, deals with the diplomatic fallacies and misrepresentations that were coming up in an effort to appease Adolf Hitler by a woman who refused to consider for a minute anything but an outright break with Adolf Hitler. And she chronicles the diplomatic efforts to hide what he was and what he was doing, and her admiration on a daily basis for the people who were not taken in. From that era about the Weimar Republic, I also have a book about radio film and the playwright Alfred Doblin, who made Berlin Alexanderplatz. And it tells an interesting story about the way the radio began to become so intelligent that it turned off the man in the street, and they turned on to totalitarianism. And it was the idea that intellectual awareness and intellectual knowledge, that appreciation of other people, that appreciation of culture was a weakness that couldn't be afforded. That's something we really need to look out for. When you look at a book like Weimar in Exile, the anti-fascist emigration in Europe and America, one of the things you see are men like me. They're lonely, they're isolated, they're alone because of the work that they do. But there are also many of them brilliant, and what they do is interesting, and what they try to do is, to say the least, inspiring. And yet some of them couldn't speak anything but German when they got to America. They were all alone, they were poor. Some of them made good, but most of them didn't. So what good is an education if it leads you into loneliness and despair? These are important questions that in a time where the alternative was to lead you into barbarism and self-destruction, which should we be nurturing? Which should we be looking out for? The barbarians or the people who invest in the heart of their own miracle of learning in appreciation of what others are bringing to the world that maybe they don't clearly understand and would like to. This remarkable book, The Psychology of Blacks, is an attempt to show that there are things rooted in the foundation of the human race that inescapably are the cultural claim of African creation, and that there's a continuity to what should be in our educational processes and recognition of that fact about our common African heritage. And I think looking, not necessarily always agreeing, looking at a spiritual contribution to what black leaders in education think should be embraced as a contribution to our society and the educational processes can help shake us out of the self-enslaving notion that our standardized ideas of white literacy are perfectly okay when they don't study black history, because they obviously are not. I don't want to close necessarily with the idea of Black Lives Matters, but there's something that Ayn Rand once said that I think helps inform what I believe. She said, people should be taught never to say something as important and powerful to another person as I love you until they can say I. That they need to be able to know who they are and so what selfhood means before they give their heart to another person. Before you say I love you, learn how to say the word I. I think because of what has happened, because of the wretchedness of slavery and segregation, I think it is reasonable for people to be asked not to say all lives matter until they can say Black Lives Matter.